Hello and welcome. As this being the first Sunday of Advent, the beginning, as you know, of the new liturgical year. This year we'll talk more about this and see more about this. Our gospel guide will be Luke, or some of you who may keep records of this is known as the C year. Advent, which is, of course, the season that we begin, is celebrated by at least 4 Sundays of Advent. This coming weekend is the first weekend of Advent. There are always 4 Sundays of Advent, not necessarily 4 weeks of Advent, although this year pretty much will be the closest we come to a full 4th week of Advent, since celebration of Christmas takes place on a Saturday. That really makes a full week there. Advent, therefore, is 4 weeks of preparation for the celebration of Christmas. In the early days, that is in the Middle Ages, it actually went 40 days, representing the 40 days that were leading up in Lent to Easter. Some thought that we should have 40 days leading up to the celebration of Christmas. I know, smiling, thank goodness, that has been reduced now to simply 4 weeks. So all of that is kind of an introduction to this very special season of the year in which we look forward to remembering the birth of Jesus among us, the beginning of the story of salvation with Jesus coming as a member of the human family. So as we celebrate the Advent season, this week continues ideas that have been prevalent for the last 2 weeks. One, we remember that the last, or the 23rd Sunday of the year, in which we were observing the gospel tradition of Mark, spoke about events that would happen in the future. And that idea somewhat was picked up, of course, as we celebrated Christ the King last week. And now this week, as we begin a new Advent season, the sense of Advent on this particular week looks not to the past, that is, getting remembrances of the coming of Jesus the first time, but rather once again our attention is directed toward Jesus coming again in glory, sometimes called in our tradition the second coming of Jesus. Now I mention all of that because that's where we're going to pick up the Gospel of Luke, not at the beginning where one might suspect, although as we go to the Christmas stories we'll see that becomes part of the Lucan tradition, but rather to the latter part of Luke's Gospel. Let me first of all give the readings that will be used this Sunday or weekend. First reading come from the prophet Jeremiah, chapter 33, verses 14 through 16. We will get a section from Paul's letter, the first letter to the Thessalonians, chapter 3, verses 12, and then chapter 4, verses 2. So at the end of 13 and the beginning of 3 and 4 there are used by the Thessalonian letter. And then when we come to Luke, who is the gospel of the week, chapter 21, verses 25 through 28, and verses 34 through 36. Now, let's look a little bit at this. We've mentioned this earlier on in previous discussions, that these 3 weeks, namely the 33rd, 34th, and now first Sunday of Advent, form a kind of triad in which we are pictured as looking for the future. 2 technical or religious terms are used here, and I thought maybe just for a moment to kind of explain them and see how they interact. One is the term eschatology, eschatology. Eschatology is a teaching or speculation about what is going to happen in the future, and more specifically, what will take place in the final future when the whole universe will undergo a radical transformation at the hands of God. So that's the idea of eschatology, a future looking and a future teaching. The other word, and one that we have looked at and spoken about before, is apocalyptic. Now, apocalyptic in some ways is an adjective which deals with the issue of how this end is going to take place. Often, as we've seen, it's received in a revelation, in a dream, in a vision. Hence, for example, last time, the dream of Daniel, who received this message, again, in a dream. Or the book of Revelation itself, which deals with a series of visions, which speaks about the end time. So the characteristics of apocalyptic are various, you remember, imagery depicting often upheavals, calamic events that are going to take on a cosmic scale. So not just things that are here on earth, but some things that involve, as it were, the whole universe. And often apocalyptic thinking, as well as apocalyptic description, pictures a conflict or a contest between good and evil. And we're very often familiar with how that is understood. This conflict between good and evil, therefore, is what we would put into framework called dualism or dualistic, two forces contending with one another. And that way of thinking is a partial to the apocalyptic outlook. And the real reason for apocalyptic thinking is to give encouragement to those who may be suffering under adverse conditions, to give them a spirit or a sense of hope. Namely, very often apocalyptic thought suggests that things will end shortly in a dramatic way, so hang in there, don't give up, it isn't going to last forever. And that might appeal particularly to those who are suffering not only physical hurt and pain, but also injustices of various kind. So all of that maybe is something to review as we look at this section. Jesus is pictured as signaling the event as coming to happen. Now, as one looks at Luke's tradition here, he basically follows the pattern that had been placed into the sequence by Mark. So very fairly, he kind of follows that. And that's why there's some things left out, as you'll notice in the sections suggested for the reading this week, because it would be repetitious of material that we had heard earlier in the Markan tradition. Now, what Luke is always, and I mention this, and we perhaps need to explore this a little bit further, is a little bit of the background. I think we've done this on other occasions, a little background with regard to Luke. Luke would be a gospel that was, we believe, penned, that is written sometime in the mid-80s of the common time. So that would put the work of Luke a half century, or at least 50 years after the time of Jesus, assuming that we are correct in seeing the death of Jesus taking place somewhere around the year 30 of the common time. So by the time that Luke has written his gospel, some significant events have occurred in the Palestinian story. Namely, there have been small pockets of Christians who have begun to accept the way of Jesus. Many of them, of course, came from Judaic background, and so they were quite familiar with the Jewish practices and traditions. But also, and keep in mind that during this time, that is between 30 and 80 of the Common Time, the famous letters of Paul had been written, and Paul had given expression to understandings about Jesus, about the Christian message. Paul, we believe, and the tradition suggests, that he had died in the city of Rome sometime under a persecution engineered by the then Emperor Nero in the 60s of Common Time. So, all of this is important to notice. Another aspect of the Lucan tradition, written, as I said, in the mid-80s, is that this third gospel writer wrote a companion piece, which is known as the Acts of the Apostles. In fact, sometimes in studying these things, those scholars will refer to Luke Acts. That's because they do present a wholeness, a kind of continuation. And we have seen sections of Acts, of course, used during the Easter season. Acts tells the story of the development of Christian communities after the ascension of Jesus until the time in which the author has completed his work. That's important to notice when we talk about now the end times, the coming of Jesus in glory, because the Acts of the Apostles, by the fact that it's telling the story of the development of earlier Christian communities, has recognized that the immediate coming of Jesus in glory was not about ready to happen. See, so that's why I mention all of this, because the Lucan writer, in putting his work together, now the Acts of the Apostles was probably written close to the time of the gospel itself. Maybe not at the same time, but certainly a couple of years afterwards. The historic event that much affected Palestinian relationships, both with fellow Jews, that is Christians, but also with the Roman government, had to do, we remember that in the year 70, I don't mean to bore you here with dates, but it's important perhaps to keep perspective here. We're talking about what happens in that 50-year period between the writing by Luke and the actual days of Jesus, was the fall of the city of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in the year 70. So in Luke's gospel, when he speaks with some certitude about how the city of Jerusalem had fallen and will project, although not in the readings we hear this week, but nevertheless in this particular chapter of Luke's gospel, chapter 21, will project to Jesus' time his describing how the city of Jerusalem will fall, makes sense because by the time it's being written, it had already happened. So we're not quite sure whether Jesus exactly predicted it, but as Luke brings those words and events to Jesus' time, it has actually happened, and so he's quite accurate in the description of the fall of Jerusalem. So I mention all of this because this space of time indicates that when Luke, unlike perhaps Mark and even to some degree Matthew, although it's much clearer here in Luke, speaks about the coming again of Jesus, he certainly understands that it would not be with the immediacy that many early Christians had expected, that even St. Paul had expected would happen, and one assumes that Peter and the other apostles would have also shared the idea that the glorious coming of Jesus in splendor was coming, but not with the immediacy that they had thought. Now I mention this because the doctrine of the second coming of Jesus maybe is not, as we hear it today, to be taken literally, and that is when we hear that there will be upheavals in the cosmic world, the sun, the moon, the stars, darkness, etc., things that we have heard earlier on, and that we will hear again alluded to in the reading from Luke this weekend, did not happen. Nevertheless, our belief and our tradition holds that Jesus will one day appear again at the end of the world, at the end of time. So what we're important to see is that it is part of our belief, it is part of our tradition. How often in the acclamations, for example, that we use to celebration of the Eucharist, Christ has died, Christ is risen, Christ will come again, remains part of our story. And so there is the doctrine of the second coming of Jesus. One day, when it will be, that we don't know. Now, it's against that background that maybe we look at the way in which Luke here offers his message to his fellow Christians, keeping a little bit of that little bit of history that I've mentioned. Once again, Jesus' words here are found as he is in the temple area teaching. This particular section in Luke's gospel, like it did in Mark's gospel, stands as the last chapter before the story of Jesus' arrest, passion, death, and resurrection take place. So in that sense, it's the last section of the teaching of Jesus. It perhaps is an interesting way to begin looking at Luke by not looking at the beginning, but by here looking at this latter part of his gospel. There are, therefore, a number of parallels, as I've mentioned, to Mark and even to Matthew here. But there is some special attention that Luke makes in telling this. He admits, as we will hear, that one ought to look for signs in the sun, in the moon, and the stars. Okay, we've said that before. What he omits is that the stars will be falling. Now, in that sense, it's a characteristic of Luke, we will see, to be often very practical. Did he know the distance of stars from the earth? I don't think so. He didn't have that scientific information. But he doesn't see the stars as falling, but simply as a way to see signs that the coming of Jesus would happen. Now that's an interesting, different perspective, is it not, of the cosmos. Keep in mind that the cosmos of first century world, and for many, many centuries, until the time of Galileo actually, really thought that you had the universe divided into three layers, namely the layers of the heavens, the layers of earth, and then the layer of the underworld. And that was the perspective that many, of course, nobody really knew any different, how to look at the universe or look at the world. And so even the extent of the cosmos of the universe was really totally unknown. And it was only from this kind of what we would call worldview that predominated from earliest times, as far as we know, as I say, right up until the days of Copernicus and Galileo, who discovered or reminded us different things about this world that we are part of. Luke mentions, and here of course is the kind of drift of the gospel, that even though we don't know when it's going to happen, and interesting here, he's the only one later on who will emphasize this, that in examining the kingdom of God, he says, is not, yes, there will be a future coming of Jesus, but the reality is that the kingdom of God is here among us. The kingdom of God is here, says Luke, and pictures his Jesus, or our Jesus, as saying that. Now, when one sees these kind of signs in the heavens, they can be disturbing, okay? And interestingly, he he says that there will be anxiety among the nations. Well, but in saying that, understand also that Luke is making a more global understanding of this coming of Jesus. That's another characteristic we will see many times in looking at Luke, that although he is writing to a community of believers who accept Jesus, many of them come from a background that was not Jewish. The author of the third gospel is certainly aware of Jewish customs and practices, but he is also aware that by this time, the believing community in Jesus has significantly increased among those who did not come from Hebrew or Jewish background, namely the Gentiles. This had been partially responsible from the way that Paul had taught, but now, after the fall of Jerusalem, the number who came to believe in Jesus was increasing. We're not sure exactly the number, how many, but significantly enough that it was beginning, if you think of the balance between those Christians of Jewish experience and those who were not, that balance is beginning to tip, not from the Jewish way, but up from to the Christian way. All right. So Jesus is pictured here as saying, look, don't be afraid. This day of reckoning will come, and one needs to stay, we need to stay prepared for it. Because, and then he mentions some of the things that people might be doing and that are not too wise to do, namely dissipation, drunkenness, and the distraction of daily life. So those 3 Ds are to be avoided. Because if one engages in those, then the day will come upon us suddenly and unexpectedly. And you can kind of imagine that that's true. If you're kind of out of it a little bit for various reasons, you might not be prepared for the coming. Now, this is kind of an interesting aspect that I would suggest here, that Luke, in cautioning against carousing, drunkenness, and worldly cares, who is he writing this to? And this gives us a little insight into the purpose, perhaps, of the Lucan gospel. 90 to 90% of the people in the first century world were folks who lived at the subsistent level of life. Many of them were farmers. Many of them who lived in the city tended to be poor. They often did not know from one day to the next where their next meal was coming from. We always kind of think, everyone was sort of like living, we do, middle class. We may not always know where everything's coming from, but pretty sure that we can provide for those. But in the first century world, that wasn't always, not always, but often wasn't the case. And we will see as the year progresses with Luke, how often his stories are based on that fact of the ordinary person's everyday needs for food, bread, sustenance, and the fact that they hoped to have it, but maybe always didn't. So when Luke says here, pictures Jesus, who's this directed to? Well, think of it, the persons who would have time to carouse and get drunk and be too much concerned about worldly things would be the elite, would be those who were in positions of some power and certainly in terms of wealth. They were the ones who could experience more regularly leisure and opportunity. And this gives us a little insight into where the Gospel of Luke might have originated and to whom it was addressed. And we will again, as I mentioned, see a number of occasions when this situation seems to be in the fore. Namely, that the community for whom this third Gospel is written were those who were somewhat well-placed in society at the time, not only with positions of power, maybe even leadership, but certainly in positions of wealth and opportunity. So it's an interesting aspect as to who the audience, if we want, of the third gospel might have been. We're not sure just where this gospel community was. The common viewpoint is that it was in Antioch in modern-day Assyria. Antioch was a very important trade city on the Mediterranean, and over the weeks when we have an opportunity, we'll come to talk a little bit more about that. But the point that I would just like to suggest as we hear this particular section from Luke, that when he talks about those kind of aberrations, that maybe those who are in good positions also need to be watchful, to be alert, to be ready, because even though the kingdom of God is here among us, the coming of Jesus in glory again could occur and might take place at any time. And that's what's important. One of the gospel commentators had this to say about apocalyptic texts. They are not about the end of the world, but about the end of empires. And that, of course, we will see is also one of the concerns that is brought up oftenly. What is the empire that will come to an end, if not Rome? Although empires have come and gone through the centuries, and maybe there is a 21st century concern here. The first reading comes from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 33, as we mentioned, and it's speaking about the fact that Jeremiah is talking to a group of fellow Hebrews who are in exile or were under siege about the year 587. And he wants to encourage, and these words again are what are brought to our attention, encourage his community to stay alert. But one of the things that he will notice is that Jeremiah, who was what we would call a prophet from the south, that would be Judea, was talking not only to his fellow Judeans, but also to fellow Israelites in the north, that when this glorious Messiah comes, he will be a Messiah for all. There is an allusion here in Jeremiah to David and to the root of David, and so these will be qualities or characteristics rather that will be developed as we move through the Advent season. So that's, I think, another reason why this particular section from Jeremiah is brought to our attention. A new king will come who will do what is right and just in the land, and of course that nicely is applicable, is it not, to Jesus. And so although the future is what this particular section is looking forward to, for Jeremiah, the Christian community interprets the coming as an appropriate title to be given to Jesus. In Jeremiah's viewpoint, God is righteousness, and this son of David will also be a man of righteousness and justice, and that truly does apply nicely to Jesus. So as we begin this Advent season, we hope that we too will stay alert and be ready to make this a different time, a better time, a time of growth in faith and in love. As I mentioned, the hope is that it is not a time of fear. We certainly live in a day in which there is cause to be fear, but that this season brings and renews within us a spirit of hope, a vision of justice and peace that will be renewed in our times and in our lives and in our Christian communities during these days. So happy Advent, and hope to see you again.